we began to break Matthew 18 into three parts. Jesus begins by declaring children and those who choose to be childlike, they're the greatest in the kingdom. And so we're looking at the kingdom, which is also looking at God's spiritual family. And we're considering, how do we care for our spiritual family? And so, here's Jesus trying to hold a baby, get a great picture, and the church is chaos around him. Fighting, arguing, everything else. And so what do we do with this dysfunctional family? And so Jesus says you become like children. He says you become childlike, and children are the greatest in the kingdom, he says. And so from that, we consider that every human being actually starts on the path of God, what the New Testament called the way. And we see that by default, children, they live in an enchanted world of the supernatural with bigger than life goodness and bigger than life love. And they start out in this, and sadly, other people happen to these children. And as we grow up, we even happen to ourselves. And the enchantment is lost. The light of the divine, it grows dim in the dark grips of injustice, of illness, and all kinds of other wrongs. And in Matthew 18, Jesus calls us, the adults, back to the path of childhood. It's a humble path, and Julie spoke about that a couple weeks ago. We considered last week that in humility there is vulnerability. That is where Jesus starts with the three parts of his family care system. We care for the vulnerable. We care for the little ones that fill the church, and these are the literal little ones, the kids that ran out, anticipated kids ministry. And we care for the deliberate ones, the deliberate little ones who are the adults, you and me, who are walking out the path of smallness, of humility on earth. So the church is full of young and old little ones who are vulnerable. And Jesus warns us, don't hurt each other's faith. Don't break the enchanted lives of those who are connected to more than just what is in front of our face every day. Don't break the enchantment that goes deeper than the surface. Because the weight and feeling of damaging someone when they are vulnerable, it will be heavier than a millstone. It'll be deeper than an ocean, and the longer experience of suffering that you will have from damaging the vulnerable will be worse than a moment of drowning. And I talk about my own experiences having lived this out, but Jesus continues, don't do it. And he says, but I know that damaging each other is inevitable, though. And I feel the misery of a world that has been damaged, and I feel the misery that each of you will carry when you end up damaging each other. Life with people is risky business. But to make things less risky, Jesus gave us work to do. He said, cut out of our lives the things that are connected to us but are damaging us, those things that have grown with us, the things that are intimately tied to us, but they damage us. And they damage our ability to live in connection with the divine. And when I remove from my life what is destroying me and hurting me, I'm then safer to others. We considered last week that this is perhaps the clearest place in Scripture where we hear today's adage, hurt people hurt people. If you're hurting, you lash out. If you're hurting, you hurt others. And Jesus is saying in this section about cutting off and plucking out body parts that I mentioned, people, they took it too literally over the years. Jesus is saying, care for the health of your faith, and you will hurt the faith of others far less. So the first step to the church family care system is for me to care for the vulnerable, and that actually begins with caring for me, where I'm vulnerable. This morning, we go to the next step. Aid the strays. At some point, all of humanity exists at the first step, the place where we're all the children. We're the greatest in the kingdom. We're born that way. But then damage drives many away. The enchanted world crumbles around us and is shattered. And we saw last week that Jesus doesn't actually place blame with those whose enchanted worlds are crushed by others. He places blame with the one who broke them, with the one who broke the faith. We consider that in the age of horrific things that are done by the church, people are deconstructing is the term. They're undoing their faith. They're deconstructing, leaving the Christian faith. And while pastors often label them the sinners, they're choosing to abandon the faith. Jesus places blame to those who caused them to leave. Jesus introduces us now to step 2, aid the stray. As we go to Matthew 18:10, he says, "Take care that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you, in heaven their angels continually see the face of my Father in heaven." The topic has moved from simply not being a cause, even inadvertently, of damaging someone's faith. And the topic is now more about acting with active disdain to the little ones. Even more here, the Greek behind the word disdain, it's nuanced to include disregard or writing them off. And we can wonder why. Why would we, fellow little ones, why would we write off other little ones? We'll find out next, because what we're going to find out is Jesus is now talking about ones who we believe have wandered away from the faith. And we can then look down on them as traitors. And you're so far out now, you're hopeless. We can view them with disdain and write them off. So here's the flow and where it's going. Jesus tells us to avoid damaging the faith of the little ones, but he tells us it's inevitable that it's going to happen. But that's no excuse. Work to mitigate it by working on yourselves. Yet, despite our work, imperfect people are going to hurt others. So let's talk about the little ones who leave due to the inevitable damage. Jesus says, don't despise the little ones that fall away. And he anticipates the response of many pastors today, and I can picture Peter especially. But Jesus, look, they aren't in the circle anymore. They left the faith. They abandoned us. They are traitors. And Jesus responds, what do you think? If a shepherd has 100 sheep and one of them has gone astray, does he not leave the 99 on the mountains and go in search of the one who went astray? And if he finds it, truly I tell you, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 that never went astray. Jesus is saying, just because they've wandered off, are they not still little ones? Any more than a sheep wanders off? Is it not a sheep anymore? No, the sheep that wanders off is still a sheep. And it still has the same worth to the shepherd it always did. And even the word astray here, it speaks to having been deceived or caused to stagger. Interestingly, we looked last week at the multiple uses of the word scandal in the previous section, and the word scandal refers to the idea of causing someone to trip. Don't trip up someone's faith. And now this word astray relates to staggering. So we're looking at someone who's been tripped, and now they're in that post-trip phase of staggering and trying to regain their balance. Jesus is telling us that we cannot lower the worth of little ones who have gone astray in their staggering. He says we can't write them off. They haven't changed in God's eyes any more than a sheep changes in the shepherd's eyes when it ends up getting lost. And God actually sees these little ones as a victim. He says, you've caused this. Luke also uses the sheep parable, but it's interesting. Matthew does something different with it. In Luke, the shepherd, who is Jesus, looks until the sheep is found. But the focus in Luke is upon the rejoicing over the sheep. Matthew mentions the rejoicing, but in Matthew's version, he shifts the focus onto the searching. Because God's will, the Father's will, is that a little one does not stay lost. And Matthew has set things up so that we are the instruments of God's will. He's told us this. You, whatever's bound and loosed in heaven, all these different things, you do that will on earth. So Matthew's saying, don't write off the little ones who get tripped up, thrown off course. Go do the work. Try to bring them back. The idea of try is important to pick up in Matthew. Matthew, he builds an uncertainty in what he is calling us to do. We may not be successful in returning a little one who has wandered off. And we're going to see that in the next section that we'll hit next week. But Luke presents Jesus as the perfect shepherd who does not stop until he successfully brings the lost sheep back. But Matthew leaves room for our failure in trying to do what Jesus is perfect at. His continued use, though, of the First Testament and the language that he uses here, it calls us back, though, to the book of Ezekiel, where the sheep are on the mountain, just like here. And Jesus says, I will find all the lost sheep. So Matthew still does what Luke does. He still says that there's a certainty that God will find the lost sheep, but he words it so that as we're called to help, he says, if you find them, you may not be perfect in your tries. Matthew words it here so that in our efforts to help, we understand we may not see it work out all the time. Even though it may not work out, though, here's how we do the work. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone. If you're listened to, you've regained, you've refound, you've reunited that one. Now I'm going to tell you, if your Bible has the words against you in it, personally, I would cross them out. They're not in the oldest manuscripts. And they throw off the meaning of everything in this section. In this section, we're talking about general sinning. Someone has wandered off and now we just see them sinning. It's not necessarily against us. We realize they're going down the wrong way. We're talking about general sinning in this section. And then Peter's going to come and say later, because he realizes what Jesus is doing, Peter's going to come and say later, that's all well and good about when they're just out there doing general sins. But what about when they sin against me? What about when they offend me? What do I do then, Jesus? And we're going to get to that. So this verse should read simply, if your brother or sister sins, go and point out the fault. Jesus starts out, and we remember tracing our steps backwards. The theme here is lost sheep, who are the little ones of the kingdom, where all of humanity starts. But for these ones, faith has failed. Faith has been broken, and they have left the faith community. And Jesus starts out, if your brother or sister sins, right off the bat, Jesus invokes family language. This sets the tone for what I believe is often held as a judicial proceeding in the church. This is actually a family matter. There's a big difference that we're going to see play out. For now, we're seeing a sibling that we have a love obligation to. And we perceive they're in trouble. They're sinning. They're not living the way that we're supposed to live, which is in unity with God and love and justice and peace. The Greek word means they're doing wrong, and so they've been tripped up. They got tripped up, and then they staggered, and they got off course from the flock of the sheep, and their orientation is all messed up, and we see that their internal compass is just thrown off, and they're lost from the flock, and they're doing something wrong. Jesus then says, go, So they're astray. They've metaphorically moved away. And they may or may not realize it. But you believe you're seeing it. So you go out to them. You don't stay where you are on the mountain and be like, hey, you idiot, get back here. You're being dumb. You don't stay on the mountain and just yell at what they're doing wrong. You go out and you meet them where they are. And that means that you place yourself with them in their perspective. And you see what things look like from where they are, and you empathize with them when you speak to them. It lets you speak in love. And then Jesus says, go and point out their fault. This is a pretty strong Greek word that does indicate you talk to them strongly with conviction. It's a strong word, as it should be, because at this point, you've grown to see them as a brother or a sister. And you've established yourself as such with them. You can't go correct someone as brother and sister if you haven't lived with them as brother and sister to establish a family relationship. So you consider them to be brother or sister, and you've considered that this word, this serious word, doesn't only speak to the strength of the conviction that you think they're sinning, but it also holds the nuance. When you point at their fault, the Greek holds the nuance that you are shedding light. Which means you can't just walk up to them and say, hey, bro, you're really screwing up right now. Yeah, gee, okay, what am I doing? I screw up a lot. What exactly are we talking about here? Come on, bro, it's so obvious. Just get back with the flock. Stop doing this. Zero light is shed in that conversation. There's been zero proving of what I might think they're doing wrong and why. So if I'm going to claim to be following this process, this passage says the weight is on me to do the explaining and to do the enlightening, the illuminating. And so I'm going out there. This is a serious word for I've taken thought on this, and I have prepared the right words to say. Also, you've considered that the language of Jesus here is presenting them as one who's the one whose fault you might go out and point out. The word here is presenting them as a victim to deception, a victim to staggering. And so when you approach this relative who is sinning, you're approaching a family member who is a victim. You're not approaching a perpetrator. And Jesus did say, though, that the family of humanity, we all perpetrate at times. We're all perpetrators at times. But he sourced that still, even the root of being a perpetrator is first in being a victim. He said the way you stop perpetrating is you start dealing with where you are being victimized. And we've seen this run all through Matthew. Jesus calls everybody victims. They're sick, they're captives, they're handicapped. So he approached them as a victimized sibling, one that you care for. And finally, if I'm going to actually go and approach someone, I have to recall how we got here in context. We're speaking of someone with faith that has been broken. They've left the flock, they've left the faith community, and we're talking about how to bring back stray sheep. Not how to run around all the sheep who are still in the flock and just call out all their sins. This is a process for lost sheep. This isn't a process for sheep who are in the flock. Just because I see one sheep who's eating on the other side of the pasture from me, it doesn't mean they're disconnected from the flock. Just because I see a sheep whose spots, whose blemishes in their life look different than mine, it doesn't mean they're gone astray. Especially when I realize they're also right next to me in the flock. I just want to point out, though, your spots, you should deal with those spots because they're different than mine. And just because I see another sheep who's tripped and fallen into some other's sheep turds, and their life isn't smelling so fresh to me, it doesn't mean they're lost. They aren't the target here necessarily. They may not be lost, especially if I otherwise notice they're sticking close enough to me that I can kind of smell their life a little bit. They might not be lost. They might not fit into this. So there's a strong Greek word that is appropriate here for something that should have gone through a lot of thought before I speak. Here's the checklist that we take from Jesus that we have to go through before we open our mouth to point out a fault. Is this the fault I want to point out in someone? Is it a broken faith issue? And I genuinely believe that this person is lost outside the flock. In modern vernacular, I'm asking, is this an issue where I believe they're not a Christian anymore? Check. Okay. Are they my brother or sister? In the sense that I have actually invested living with them as family, to the point where I hold sibling love for them, and I have built myself into their life to where they view me as a sibling. Check, okay. Have I now gone out to them and placed myself with them in their perspective to where I can now speak with empathy? And from their perspective, am I still comfortable with having checked off the last two boxes? So now that I have their perspective, do I look around from where they are and say, okay, is this really still a faith issue? Do I still perceive they're outside the flock now that I've placed myself in their shoes? And now having their perspective, is there actually a family relationship between them and me? Check. Okay. So the next one, am I prepared to establish the standard by which I'm checking these boxes as the standard by which other people will check the boxes with me? Okay, check. If I've checked these things, I'm ready to speak to them. But there's one last box to be checked. Are we alone? Am I one-on-one with them? If you've decided that this matter is big enough to check all these boxes, I'm saying they're not a Christian. They're not in my faith circle. If it's this big of an issue, then it's big enough to handle privately first. And people say, okay, so I don't shame them, right? No. It's to save you from shame, possibly too. This is a big limb to go out on. And it's a big claim to make. And when I decide it's worth going out on this limb, what if the response shames me? What if I say, I'm here to shed light on your faith issue that is so serious, I consider you lost. You're a lost sheep, and I'm here to shed light on this. And they respond convincingly to where, in my logic, I actually made a mistake. I made a mistake in thinking it was a serious issue or any issue at all. And they show me the error of my ways. I'm glad I didn't make that accusation in front of everybody. What if you get past the faith part, but they respond, maybe it is an issue. Maybe it's an issue, but do you really think who do you think you are talking to me about it? Do you really think that you have built a sibling love with me that gives you a right to speak to me? Where have you been in my life for X, Y, and Z? I could say, well, I say hi on Sundays. I baked you a lasagna 3 years ago when you were sick with COVID and we had that meal train. It's not going to cut it. And it's okay if in your life that's all you have time for with some people. There's no guilt on that. If that's all life allows, we live busy lives. And we still get to be joyful acquaintances at church. But if that's all that my life has given me time for, then my life has not given me a place to speak to them as a sibling. By going to them in private, I've avoided the shame on me of revealing just how far I chose to assume I could overstep into their life when I've never really built a place for them in my life. But let's say I passed the family test. I still save myself shame by going to them privately when I claim to them that I can empathetically tell you, I get it. I have gone out to you and I see it from your perspective and I get it. I can understand. And they respond, do you really get it? Let me tell you about where I'm standing and what I'm seeing from where I stand. And they speak to me. And as they speak to me, they enlighten me to where they are standing and what they are seeing. And I realized I wasn't even close to placing myself in their shoes. Now that I am in their shoes, now that I have been shown where they're standing, I'm the one who's grateful this happened in private. Because seeing things now from their perspective, I realize I completely misjudged the situation. Embarrassingly so. And I would have felt so ashamed to have made my accusation in front of others, not realizing I never actually made it out to them. But our verse for today ends with, if you are listened to, you have regained that one. You're going to hear kids come back. And as it ends, if you are listened to, this translates to, if your words are received and confirmed as true. If. There's the word. It's the word from the lost sheep a bit ago. This isn't guaranteed to work for us. But if this process holds true and my words are listened to, I have aided a stray sheep in finding its way back to a faith community. If you're listened to, the flock has regained a sheep, a loved brother or sister that was lost. If your words are listened to, you have gone through a whole lot of learning yourself. You have examined, how well am I living out family? You've examined, what are they going through in their life? When I go out to them and place myself in their shoes. You considered, am I ready to shed light on this issue? There's a whole process of formation that happens. Now you're a changed person too that they come back to.